Cosmic chess match, Kasparov vs Topalov. This match is considered one of the most beautiful matches in the history of chess. This game was played in 1999 in the Netherlands. Kasparov plays with the white pieces and opens the game with the pawn to e4. Topalov pawn to d6. Kasparov with the pawn to d4. Topalov knight to f6. Kasparov knight to c3. Topalov pawn to g6. Kasparov bishop for e3. Topalov bishop of the g7. Kasparov queen of the d2 ready to castle in on the queen's wing. Topalov pawn to d6. Kasparov has many options, including the knight for f3, the pawn for a1, or the castling, but he played the pawn for f3, and this move confused Topalov a lot, because he did not expect it. Topalov plays the b5 pawn to prevent the bishop from positioning on the c4 square. Kasparov the knight to e2. Topalov knight to d7. Kasparov the bishop to h6 to prevent the threat of the bishop in the g7. Topalov eats bishop with bishop. Kasparov is eating the bishop by the queen. Here Topalov can't castle in the king's suite. Topalov bishop to b7. Kasparov pawn to a3, and this is a preemptive defensive move. Topalov pawn to e5. Kasparov castle on the queen's wing. Topalov queen to e7 ready to castle. Kasparov moved the king to b1. Topalov the pawn to a6. Kasparov knight for the c1. Topalov castle king. Topalov the knight to b3, and here we notice that Kasparov is heading towards the wing of the queen to put pressure on the king. Topalov pawn to d4. Kasparov takes the black pawn by the rook. Topalov with the pawn to c5 to claim the rook. Kasparov moves the rook to d1. Topalov knight to b6. Kasparov with the g3 pawn to open the way for the bishop. Topalov the king to b8 to avoid white bishop's attack. Kasparov to a5 by knight. Topalov retreated to the bishop to a8. Kasparov the bishop to h3. Topalov with the pawn to d5, and this move is unsuccessful, because he made the king's wing exposed. Kasparov took advantage of the loophole and played with the queen to f4. And here is a check, and the king became compressed by the queen, the bishop, and the knight. Topalov, the king to a7, which is a fairly appropriate stretcher, since he will not be able to protect the king in any other way without sacrifice. Kasparov, the rook to e1. Topalov, with the pawn to d4 claims the knight. Kasparov, the knight to d5. Topalov takes the knight by his knight. Kasparov takes the knight with the pawn. Topalov, the queen to d6, and here is the queen versus the queen. Kasparov has a lot of options here, and from here the greatness and intelligence of this player appears. As he moved the rook to the d4 square, and this move is not expected by many players. But at the same time, it is a very dangerous move, if Topalov understood its significance. Its importance will appear in the coming transfers. Topalov took the rook with the pawn, and here he took the bait, and it was better for him to move the king to b6, but he missed the opportunity. Kasparov with the rook to e7 and a check. Here some think that Topalov is able to take the rook with the queen, but if he did, he would have lost the match after 3 moves, as white will take the pawn in d4 with the check, and the black king has only b8 square. After that, the white queen to b6, and here the match is considered over, but here Topalov played the king to b6. Here Kasparov started chasing the king. Kasparov takes the pawn in d4 with a check. Topalov takes the knight in a5 by the king. Kasparov the pawn to b4 and check. Topalov the king to a4. Kasparov with the queen to e3. Topalov the queen takes the pawn on d5 square, and has no other choice to protect the king. Kasparov rook to a7. Topalov bishop to b7, which is a necessary move. Kasparov eats the bishop by the rook, and here Topalov cannot take him with the queen, because if he did it, Kasparov would advance his queen to b3 and checkmate. The important thing here is that Topalov made a different move. He took the queen to c4 to offer to swap the 2 queens. Here Kasparov refuses to exchange, and takes the knight in the f6. Topalov by the king takes the pawn at a3. Kasparov takes the pawn on square a6 with check. Topalov takes the pawn on the b4. Kasparov the pawn to c3 and a check. Topalov takes the pawn in c3. Kasparov continues to chase king by queen to a1 and check. Topalov king to d2. Kasparov to b2 and cheek. Topalov with the king to d1. Kasparov to the f1. Bishop in the face of the queen, and here some may wonder that, why Topalov did not take the bishop by the queen. If he does it, he will end up in two moves, the queen to c2, check, then the king to e1, here the white rook to e7 and checkmate. On the whole, he didn't do it, he played rook to d2, to claim Kasparov's queen. Here Kasparov played one of the most beautiful moves, as he moved the rook to d7. Topalov here is obligatory to take the rook at d7 with the rook. Kasparov takes the queen with a bishop. Topalov takes the bishop by the pawn. Kasparov takes the rook in the h8. Topalov here realized that he was inevitably a loser, and he decided to withdraw. Thank you.